That really is one of my favorite quotes from Mark Twain. Now, it's just kind of to set everything up for everyone that we're not going to sit here and talk today about beating up on one side or another in the battle that seems to be what we define as labor relations. Instead, we're going to have some fun. More to the point, we're going to actually try to have as much fun as we can with labor relations. And I know the idea in and of itself about having fun with something like labor relations at a time at an economic downturn since the Greatest Depression might be like, oh, counterproductive or disadvantageous. But there really is something that we can do with this today. And what we want to do is apply some industrial strength transparency to a process that is all but hidden from outsiders, and those on the inside are usually forced to view it through a very small semi-opaque lens. But it's high time we tried to point out that the emperor is not only wearing no clothes whatsoever, but he really needs to have a doctor take a look at that thing on his back. Now, this might make people squeamish, not the thing on the emperor's back, but labor relations and transparency. It's, after all, labor relations only tend to garner attention when people are hurling insults at one another or trying to come up with new and creative ways to apply the latest logical fallacy. But the point is that the arts have become so comfortable with not only having anyone not really challenge their ideas about labor relations that even the faintest rays of transparency are met with stereotypical, almost cartoonish reactions. But the good news in all of this is people tend to take a step back and see things with a lot more perspective when you employ some satire. And this business has no shortage of raw material to work with, fortunately. Now, to that end, when the actual opportunity crossed my desk to take this stereotypical cartoonish behavior and actually turn it into a cartoon, I thought that might be a good idea. And ever since then, it's been an extraordinarily useful tool for me to help not just talk about the ideas that I'm trying to get out about the future of labor relations, but also serves as a mirror so people can see themselves in some of the egregious behaviors that they actually have. So, to begin with, I want to read the cartoon's disclaimer. Now, all characters appearing in these cartoons or works are fictitious. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. So, if you think you see yourself in any of these characters, it's probably a classic case of psychological projection, which is the unconscious act of denial of a person's own attributes, thoughts, and emotions, which are then ascribed to the outside world, such as to the weather, the government, a tool, or to other people. You might want to seek help from a licensed mental health care provider. Hopefully you'll see a little bit of yourself in all of this. Hopefully you'll see a little bit of other people in all of this. But the idea is that you'll get a better a clearer picture of where we're trying to go to point out the things that people don't seem to be paying attention to today. And let's begin by reviewing what people think they know about stakeholders. And for this particular exercise, I just want to limit stakeholders to board members, administrators, and the individual artists inside organizations, musicians, dancers, whatever it's going to be. Here's a stereotypical view that continues to pop up in a lot of mainstream media. Now, as over the top as this might appear, this is an actual statement from a board chair that I heard with my own ears. One of the little dirty secrets inside the field is that the people legally entrusted with the authority to make the final decision and act as stewards of public trust are usually the least knowledgeable people about how the arts really work, who artists are, and how all of this fits together in the community. Ironic, isn't it? But it also goes a long way toward pointing out one of the larger cracks in the labor foundation, and that's that it's all too common for stakeholders to view labor relations as primarily focusing on the interaction during active bargaining cycles. When combined with the ironic nature of board involvement and the increasingly detached artist participation in day-to-day operations, which we'll be examining shortly, it doesn't take long to create a vast gulf between the stakeholders at either end of this spectrum. But at least our board caricature gets credit for calling the musicians musicians instead of employing the U word, unions. I can't count the number of times I've heard these sentiments along those lines during my own consulting work, especially when tempers run hot. albeit usually with a few more colorful metaphors thrown in. It's statements like this that point to one of the growing problems in a labor relationship, and both end up in the same place, which is they tend to dehumanize the stakeholders involved. You see them as caricatures instead of people. In those cases, you can almost see the following mental image in the mind of some board members and executives when they think about unions. It's at this point in time where a history lesson usually comes in handy to dispel some of these sorts of myths. A long time ago, in an era far, far away, known as the 1960s, orchestra musicians decided they wanted to represent themselves in negotiations. Until that time, orchestra associations negotiated directly with the local union president, like the stout gentleman in our cartoon here. And those individuals looked at symphony musicians as some of the highest paid gig players in town, which was true, so why bother pushing for much else? But the musicians finally won out, and as a result, they have far more direct control over crafting specific conditions in their bargaining agreements, especially compared to other unions like the United Auto Workers. They got to select their negotiator, they have elected representatives participate in all bargaining sessions, and they have to ratify any proposal by a completely democratic vote of all the members. Now, this system is far from perfect, but it does mean that the stereotypical image of guys who look like this controlling the labor pool is really as far from reality as it possibly can be. In fact, the organization's artists have substantially more control over how working relationships evolve and negotiations unfold than any outside union influence. So if you hear someone complaining about union control, but whether they even realize it or not, they're actually talking about the artists. So it shouldn't come as a surprise to learn that when employers approach relationships with a union overlord stereotype in mind, all they end up doing is agitating their own artists. And that usually ends up in one place. By the way, they really do have a cowbell app for the iPhone. It's actually a lot of fun. If you look at the groups who are successfully managing debt right now, or those who are even enjoying periods of stability, and yes, there are groups who are actually growing and thriving in this environment, you'll still notice a few common traits, such as mutual respect and unusually high levels of regular stakeholder involvement in day-to-day operations. All of it with a complete lack of pretense. It also means they don't make a point of going around telling everyone how much they respect one another, which I think most of us probably know that if you have to walk around telling someone how much you respect someone else, it probably means that you really don't respect them. So how does the labor side of the equation come unbalanced in all of this? Where does righteous indignation like this come from? One of the real benefits following the big changes that transpired in the 1960s via increased musician involvement in negotiations is the entire field enjoyed a period of unprecedented evolution. And by evolution, I don't just mean growth or building or larger budgets, but relationships between stakeholders actually improved, not without growing pains, but old limitations were tossed out the window and everyone started filling in this new frontier. The problem is that after time, too many organizations forgot that in order to maintain trust, it takes continuous, ongoing relationships. In short, people became lazy. For musicians, all of that on-the-job training with this evolution and growth related to relationship and trust building was slowly becoming a lost art from one generation to the next. And to make matters worse, the one area where unions could have played a vital role by creating a series of sustained training programs for musicians and artists, teaching them how to not just represent their peers, but fully interact with the organization, never materialized. So there's no getting around the fact that people became complacent. The result was an increasing number of gaps in training new generations of representatives. Combine this with the unintentional result of increased professionalism through the arts administration field, which in turn never bothered to teach their managers how to engage artists and board members, and you end up with a sort of hyper dysfunction that pops up during low periods of economic cycles. Sound familiar? What's important to realize at this point is there are no silver bullets to labor harmony. The best negotiation model is only as good as the people participating. So in order to build a healthy relationship, we need to be honest with one another and have the courage to embrace transparency. And speaking of transparency, let's apply some of that right here and now and own up to what most of the labor troubles are really all about, regardless if it's at the bargaining table or during strategic planning processes or right down to day-to-day working relationships. Dominant control. There's always going to be a fight over control. We need to stop pretending that that's what we haven't been fighting over for decades. Employers want to be able to tell the artist what to do, when to do it, how to get it done without any restrictions or feeling like they're being held hostage to every last artist whim. I actually have seen a strike take place simply because the musicians didn't like the series of guest conductors that were on the roster that year. But on the other hand, artists do want wage and benefit guarantees along with parameters placed on working conditions, lest they end up in a community engagement scheme that looks like this. Unfortunately, it's become fashionable to take our fights over control and package them in these little boxes marked community engagement or structural deficits or artistic integrity or pay parity, or whatever jargon du jour is all the rage on either side of the labor management equation. In the end, regardless of how the fight settles, the core struggle over control continues to simmer. Even during periods of intense economic stress, we manage to find ways to interject unrelated control issues into a process as cut and dry as emergency wage concessions. Talk about making a bad situation worse, it's almost as though some people in the field are going out of their way to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. But in order to build a healthy labor relationship, both sides need to realize the struggle for control is expected, and each individual organization will only find a sustainable balance between the extremes once they abandon the goal of obtaining dominant control in the relationship. The next point we're going to talk about is training. And of all the issues involved in labor relations, this is the one where artists need to do the most work. And to be clear, I'm not talking about artistic training. They're good usually at what they do already, or they wouldn't be there to begin with. But training to be fair and responsible representatives and sincere and engaged institutional stakeholders. Increasingly, they become engaged only during active bargaining cycles, and incoming representatives receive little to no training on how to function in their roles in the stead. As a stakeholder, interaction has been reduced to some sort of Cold War labor détente. It should come as no surprise then that committee service for artists is inspired far more by settling a personal grudge with someone in management as opposed to sincere stakeholder responsibility. Combine this with a complete lack of understanding about institutional history, and you end up with members who focus on the least important of issues. As of now, there are no major initiatives I'm aware of inside the artist unions to reverse this trend. Training material, where available, is incomplete and woefully out of date, and there are no dedicated human resource committee representatives can approach for advice and support for issues related to establishing and maintaining a healthy ongoing relationship with board members and administrators. And I'll add even just a personal note here. You know things are really getting bad in the relationship when the artists start to reach out to consultants like me. I've worked for more player associations and orchestras that are frustrated with these problems I'm talking about. So they will spend their own money out of their own pockets to bring someone in to do something that honestly the union should have been paying for all along. But it brings up perhaps what is now the final and most important issue that we're going to look at today, which is accountability. I'm a tuba player, so I can laugh at this. But there really is nothing funny about accountability. It's serious. And it's difficult to get over the idea that sometimes accountability means a referendum on you. But sometimes that's how the process unfolds. But I prefer to look at accountability as the driving force that maintains a commitment to ethics and values. As a field, the arts contribute to society not through their mission statements, but also through how they conduct their business in an environment that has almost zero independent oversight. And the first step in that process is being able to be accountable to one another. Remember the irony about board members? This is where it moves from being ironic to tragic, in that far too often, the people who are charged with oversight and accountability are not in a position to properly carry out these functions. To a large degree, the gap has been filled in by stakeholders who are willing to speak up with the voice of accountability, but that detachment that they've been having in the day-to-day operations and the meaningful relationship makes those calls ring a little more hollow than they used to these days. The other unintentional byproduct is the field is no longer in a position to adequately recognize and reward administrators and board members who do an exemplary job. Instead, a culture of the lowest common denominator drags down those who excel until mediocrity becomes the norm. In the end, all this leads to the sort of fights that we see today, which really are far more about fighting a fight than fighting over whatever the issue is. Now, I can't write that prescription for you today, but what I want everyone here to leave with today is the knowledge that all this can rapidly change for the better in very short order. We need to remember that winning a fight isn't what the disagreement is all about. We need to let go of stereotypical outlooks and become better people who spend more time being straightforward with each other and building trust than we spend attempting to cover our real intentions with spin-laden press statements. We need to be people who care to be involved in the organization beyond the point of determining what goes into our own paycheck. We need to create a culture that embraces and rewards transparency, along with holding stakeholders responsible for their outcomes. And we need to remember that in order to let each organization reach its full potential and be everything we dream it can be, we must share control and do our part to be better tomorrow than we are today. It might mean fewer cartoons for me in the future, but it'd be a good thing.